Welcome to this session, Reclaiming the High Street. My name is Niall Crowley and I'm your chair. I'm the producer and presenter of this podcast, Art's First Podcast. Please check us out. It's a new project that we're very excited about. So you can find us on artsfirst.uk. Let's thank the Belonging Forum, for Kim Samuels, for sponsoring the discussion. The Belonging Forum is dedicated to finding practical solutions to combat social isolation and help foster belonging. So that's the kind of connection to the high street. And before I forget, I'd like to thank all of the BOI volunteers, the battle volunteers, and also worldwrite who are doing their filming, and the Church House volunteers, without which all of this wouldn't happen. The whole discussion about the high streets kind of seems like it's been going on for decades, probably since the 80s, really, isn't it? And it's kind of a prism for, or a metaphor for economic and industrial decline and cultural decline, as well as social fragmentation. And just trying to think of solutions to it. I mean, I think, the best brains in the world have been, or in the country, have been working on it. And it's something that I know I've been chasing my tail. I'm really trying to work out a solution to the problem. So hopefully we'll get a bit closer to that today. All our speakers, as I'm sure you're aware, have very extensive and illustrious biographies, and please chat to them later or check them out on the BOI website. So I'll introduce them very briefly in the order that I'm going to ask them to speak. So Sam Bidwell on my left is a freelance journalist, consultant, and the director of the Next Generation Centre, which is a research unit at the Adam Smith Institute, with the aim of improving the lives of younger people through market-orientated policies. Neil Davenport, also on my left, has taught politics and sociology and further education at sixth forms around London for at least around the past 20 years. He's also worked as a journalist and a music writer, a very readable music writer. And most recently, he's the author of one of the letters on liberty, which I hope you've seen or read, called Defending Pubs and Freedom, which is great. I really recommend it. Paul Finch, to my right. Welcome, Paul is a former editor of Building Design and quite a few other prestigious architectural journals. He was a founder member of CABE, the Commission for Architecture in the Built Environment, that's come up as a subject of debate here many times over the last few years. He also chaired the London Olympic Design Review Panel, so knows a lot about regeneration, we hope or presume. Lord Daniel Moylan, who's on my right as well, is the former deputy leader of Kensington and Chelsea Council. He was the deputy chairman of TfL, or Transport for London, under Boris Johnson when he was mayor, and also the chair of the London Legacy Development Corporation around the time, in the run to the Olympics and the Paralympic Games. And he's someone that I always find worth reading and listening to in the Lords, and you can't say that about too many people. Deborah Nagan on my right is a director at Deb Nagan Studios, which advises on landscape, sustainability and infrastructure, the built environment, cities and art projects. As a mayor's design advocate, Deborah has advised on high street renewal, and much more, which have a look on the website and you can read her full biography. She's a passionate advocate for quality, sustainable design, production, placemaking and business. So that's our panel. Rizam, do you want to kick us off, please?
Absolutely. Well, look, thank you all for being here and for that kind introduction. I'm going to start us off with a little bit of a reflection on the economics. So as James Carville, Bill Clinton's political strategist in the 1990s, used to say, it's the economy stupid. Why is the high street struggling? Well, it's impossible to get away from some of those economic fundamentals. I can give you a kind of microcosm example. I grew up in a small post-industrial town in northeast Wales. I go home a few times a year, and I find that the high street is completely desolate. All the banks have gone, all the cafes have gone. People don't have the disposable income to spend their time there. I visited a friend the other day who lives just off the Northcote Road in Clapham, which some of you may know. Guess what? It's thriving. And the reason for that is an economic question. In places like Clapham, people simply have the disposable income to go and spend their time at physical shops. They have not just the economic means, but they have the time. Lest we forget that leisure time is not a luxury that everybody can necessarily afford. So we're thinking here about, in that part of the world, younger graduates, single people or young couples who don't necessarily have some of the time pressures, which also prevent people from coming to the high street. Guess what? If you're busy raising children, you might find that it's much easier and cheaper to order your clothing off Amazon rather than going out and spending lots of time on the high street. So I think the shape of our economy is something that we can't escape. For businesses in particular, I think about high energy prices. We have some of the highest business energy prices in Europe. For industrial energy prices, which certainly aren't necessarily a measure for your kind of boutique high street store, but which nevertheless give us a broad indicator of where the UK's energy landscape stands. We have the highest in the G7 and the highest in Europe. For lots of businesses, keeping the lights on is a simple problem that fundamentally underwrites all of their other difficulties. So the economics, I think it's very, very difficult to get away from. While we don't have a growing economy which rewards entrepreneurialism, which has sufficiently low energy prices that businesses can get on, we're really going to struggle to have thriving high streets. Guess what? It's no surprise that in the areas where broader economic decline has been deepest since 2008, high street decline has followed pretty much concurrently. This is very closely linked to the broader growth environment. But the other point is a point on economic choice, because this economic environment, this low growth, sluggish economy, is not happening in a vacuum. It's also happening in a world of digitalization, where more services are going online, and in fact, not just are going online, have gone online. In fact, Amazon now is a reality. It's not a burgeoning or nascent trend, and we are asking businesses now to compete with businesses like Amazon. Our high street businesses are now competing for attention, for time, and for resources with Amazon. And guess what? We're tying their hands behind their backs as we do so. We have some of the highest business rates in Europe. Amazon, guess what, doesn't pay business rates, right? It's not a physical store. You're not competing on an even footing. Again, energy prices. Yes, Amazon has enormous energy prices, but there's a centralized inside of a kind of international mega corporation. We're forcing small businesses, often family run, often just a couple of people with an idea and a skill, to stump up some of the highest energy costs anywhere. And we at the Adam Smith Institute have recently conducted some research on pubs and nightlife in particular. And nowhere is this truer than in the case of pubs. We're asking pubs now to compete with cheaper supermarket alcohol, with not smoking whatsoever. There are changing approaches to lifestyle and how people choose to spend their time. And it's not just business rates for pubs, it's energy prices. It's also then alcohol taxes. It's local alcohol levies that you have in some parts of London. We are asking services to stump up more of their money for fixed costs and taxation, rather than spending that money on growing their businesses, making themselves more attractive, etc. And we wonder why people are choosing not to frequent their high street businesses. I'll give you a kind of a stat to leave you with, which is, as a publican, you may already know, the median margin for a UK pub last year was 4%. As median. So by definition, half are making less than 4%, half are making more than 4%. We're seeing thousands of pub closures a year. And we also conducted a bit of research as part of our broader story on pubs about why people were choosing to go out and drink less. And there is this narrative, it's young people who are not so interested in drinking anymore, changing social attitudes. We found that the overwhelming reason that people drink less is because it costs too much. Why does it cost too much? Again, it's those fixed costs. It's the broader shape of the economy. It's energy prices, it's taxation, it's regulation, it's levies, it's all of these different things. As a young person now, the idea of a pub crawl where you go out and drink 8 pints, you spend £100. That's, at a minimum in London. That's a real economic investment. If we really want to tackle this stuff, I think there's absolutely more we need to do in terms of thinking about what a modern high street looks like. We need to think more about urban design and architecture and infrastructure. Those things are all absolutely key, and I'm sure we'll hear more about that from some of our other panelists and from you in the audience. But what I kind of want to underscore the discussion with is the sense that there's no getting away from the fundamental economics of this. If high street businesses can't survive, if they don't have a business environment that welcomes and rewards them for providing a good product to customers, guess what? Those businesses will go bust. I'll leave it there.
Great. Thank you. We'll save our applause for later. That was a great start, Sam. And yeah, absolutely. I think even 15, 20 years ago, we were making a couple of p off a pint of beer. And then I think it was probably about £3 or £4 a pint. And now it's about 7. But yeah, I'll leave that there. Neil? Do you want to say?
Okay, thank you, Niall. I want to focus on 3 points, which some of it touches on the last speaker, the form that the decline of the high street takes and who it impacts on. I think that's quite important. Secondly, how the decline of the high street undermines sense of community and social cohesion. And thirdly, to assess some of the existing measures to combat high street decline, which I'm sure members of the audience would like to sort of chip in on as well. One of the points I would just make about the valid economic reasons for the decline of the high street. We have a problem in this country of absent landlords, whereby shop fronts are left empty year after year. And one of the regenerative measures against that is to force sort of landlords to actually do something about these empty shops. So in terms of what form this impact takes in terms of the decline of the high street, no surprise it impacts disproportionately on red wall constituencies, particularly in Hull and Sunderland. Something like 17.3 to 23% of shops on a high street are still vacant. They haven't been renewed in terms of a replacement of a shop. The other part of this discussion, which I think is sometimes neglected, is the amount of high street banks that have been shut down, which has a really sort of devastating impact for our older people. So it's predominantly in the northeast. It's predominantly in regions outside of London where the decline of the high street is most sort of keenly felt. Okay, so we can discuss further on that later on. So it impacts on the provinces and working class communities far more. In terms of how it impacts on social cohesion and a sense of community, I think what the decline in the high street tends to encourage is a sort of disconnect. It means that there are less points of connection, of intergenerational points of connection. That was what the high street sort of provided. And it means that if you're living in a very sort of ugly environment, you're going to take sort of less care of it. And one of the more sort of disturbing trends that we've seen over the past decade is that when people are disconnected, they discontented over a political issue, they tend to take it out on their locality, which is an entirely sort of new process. Protests in the past didn't involve, setting a fire to your local cost cutter. And that's the form it has. And so it does have a spiraling negativity on how people, interact with the community. And as we know from a lot of criminologists, it does generate and encourage further criminal behaviour in terms of that sort of spiraling knock-on effect of a sense of disorder in a local community. A sense of untidiness in a local community just only encourages sort of further antisocial behaviour. And obviously rescuing the high street and rescuing points of connection is important in sort of tackling that. In terms of some of the existing measures that have been used to combat high street decline, a number of councils in this country have attempted to revive the high street, not just as a commercial zone, but also as a civic zone. And I'd fully endorse that in terms of reviving a civic culture, because in Victorian society, the high street was as much a civic centre as it was a centre of exchange. So places like Bishopsgate in Leeds, their sort of pioneering approach has been to create what's called a sort of sticky community, whereby instead of a high street being about traffic and people moving through, you actually want to contain people in a specific commercial area. And they've had a great deal of success with that in terms of Not so much, it's not pedestrianisation, which has got a lot of sort of problems with it, but just ensuring that people congregate in a specific commercial area and keeping people there to sort of create almost like a sort of carnival fete atmosphere. There's one solution they come up with high street decline. The Power to Change group advocating a buyout fund of high streets, similar to what the last speaker was talking about, in terms of there has to be some type of funding for smaller businesses that are facing decline. Councils in Sunderland have had great success and also in Wrexham of focusing on commercial regeneration, but also civic regeneration in terms of arts communities, live music venues, galleries, and so forth. So the key point with a lot of these solutions is how do we get people together again to recreate that sense of cohesion and community. And I think the measure on that is not just simply on the commercial aspect, which is important, but also the civic aspect of people feeling part of the community. And I think if that's regenerated, then it will sort of combat the sense of atomisation and privatisation that the COVID lockdown sort of brought to the surface. Okay, but we can touch upon some of these solutions that have been offered in the discussion. So on the one hand, it is a pretty bleak picture out there in terms of the state of the high street, but there are sort of glimmers of hope in terms of sort of combating this, and it's kind of very useful that there is a lot of energy going on in attempting to sort of revive the high street, which hopefully this discussion can contribute to. I'll leave it at that point.
Okay, that's great. Everyone's keeping to time. This is very good. Paul, do you want to give us your thoughts? Thank you very much, Nobel.
Well, if this was a simple problem, then probably the Mary Porter's report, which I think had about 27 recommendations, would have been adopted and implemented by government. As far as I can tell, hardly any of them have been. And that's because I think the problem is rather more complex than it first appears. We haven't just lost banks and post offices, but we've lost butchers, fishmongers, libraries, swimming baths, police stations. It's the world where the mixed variety of retail activity of somewhere like Leather Lane in Holborn is now replaced by just endless pop-up fast food stores. Pubs are fast vanishing because they're just far too expensive. On the other hand, globally, retail is making a recovery post-COVID in countries across the world. And if you look at the charts that people like CBRE produce, it looks as though we're heading back to the same general levels of retail activity that we were before COVID. But that's expenditure, which is not geographically the same at all. So the areas that we've seen expanding on the high street or substituting for closures, we've of course had a massive expansion in cafes. And actually, compared with most shops that people go into in the high street, cafes are, of course, far more social. I mean, I think I would go as far as to say that it's far more likely that you will get social interaction on high streets today, or the opportunity to do so, precisely because of this plethora of, Pret and Costa and Leon and all those people where people go in. They might leave with a coffee, especially if they're using it as commuters on their way to work, but they might sit in there and, who knows, meet old friends or make new ones. We've had an extraordinary increase in Turkish barbers. We've had a huge increase in general food-based stores, particularly with a halal offer, which essentially has replaced all those butchers that vanished, partly as a result of COVID, but more likely because of BSE, if you remember that, the old gag, BSE stood for Butcher Shop Empty. You have wine bars instead of pubs, up to a point. I think it'd be a mistake to say that the high street is dead, in other words. And it is true that certainly in rural and red line constituencies, it's been hit worse for the reasons that have been quite rightly been stated. But it's not entirely the picture. And I suppose the thing is, is how much of a problem is it compared with all the other problems we face? And are there any clues in any of the policies or attitudes that more successful places have adopted that we might be able to learn from? And I suppose my proposition, if I've got one, is that you need to find a way of curating high streets. It used to happen with market forces and economic activity, and you could just rely on, well, if people wanted this thing or that thing, then over a period of time, that's what you would get, and shops would change, and the stuff they sold would change. But you didn't have to worry too much about it from an overall point of view, and that no longer seems to be the case. So in looking at the sorts of people who curate successful successful high streets, let's say the most obvious example, at least in London, are the landed estates. So, you know, Marylebone High Street's a brilliant example of a real mixture of uses. Why? Because they're all controlled by the Howard Walden estate. And if they want to give a rental to the shop that sells buttons on Marylebone Lane, which I'm sure they could let off far greater money to some hedge fund, that's what they'll do, because those long-term estates, I think, got the message that amenity creates value. The livelier your high street, the greater the value of the properties in the high street, above those shops and around it. Another model of curation would, of course, be new towns. I'm going back now, where you have an entirely public sector controlled situation, and somebody can make kind of political, economic, sociological dispositions of what sort of thing it is they want, and try to control the market through that most traditional of British conditions, ownership. And then finally, I suppose you've got the kind of the mixed mode, where you have bids, or you have identifiable groups of the private sector entrepreneurs and people actually doing business, working in harness with local authorities that want to have, as it were, an umbrella under which good things that could happen. I suppose one example of that would be Liverpool, where actually the Grosvenor estate, the landed estates again, work with the local authority there to completely transform a whole series of what we could think of as high streets. Just one final point, I think one has to distinguish, and I'm not sure Mary Porter's did really, between town centres and high streets. I mean, Tottenham High Road is 1.5 miles, 2 miles of kind of independent grocers making 50 quid a week, and, you know, hardly any national retailers. But is it a town centre? No, it's not. So I think we should be careful about making an assumption. If only you get the town centre right, everything else is okay. It might be, but it might not.
Great, thank you. That's a lot to think about there, the curating the high street. I hope that we get to discuss that interesting idea. Daniel, Lord Moylan?
I wonder whether there isn't an element of nostalgic self-delusion going on around here. I mean, I've known Paul for years, but I didn't know Paul, and he marched up to me while I was having my solitary breakfast in Lyon and attempted to engage me in conversation. I think I run screaming from the shop. One of the things I do at the moment is I chair the House of Lords Bills Environment Select Committee, and perhaps I have an unfair advantage or otherwise, in that we have spent the last 9 months doing a report, an inquiry into high streets, and we haven't published it yet. It should come out next month is the plan. So I have to be very careful in that if I say anything about it, you must please accept that I've declared that I'm not saying this on behalf of the committee, is my own views. Until the report comes out, I can't tell you what the committee thinks, and I can't commit anybody else to anything I say. First thing we learned was that there is no definition of a high street. Nobody has a definition of a high street. We're talking about something we can't actually define. The Office of, the Ordnance Survey have a definition which they use purely for mapping purposes, but it's a technical definition. It's about a certain length of street. It has to be a certain length minimum that has a certain density of shops in it, and that's your high street, but that's the only part of the definition. So we don't really know in any clear sense what we're talking about. But the other thing we've heard is that insofar as we do know what we're talking about, the high street probably isn't in decline, but is in a state of perpetual and long-term transition. It is always in transition. It has never actually stood still. If we start with our famous and much beloved pubs, the decline of which is seen as a sign of the high street. Pubs are, as Paul will know, an almost entirely 20th century invention. Nearly every pub you see on a high street, especially in an urban setting, was built roughly between 1890 and 1910. They were built as people's palaces. They were usually corner premises where they could get them. They were extravagant. They were glorious. They were there to pull in punters by looking magnificent. And they were aimed solidly at the working classes. There's a completely different... Why would we expect something invented for social circumstances and profit, huge profits made by the breweries around that period, in 1900 to continue into the 21st century? That's the first. Banks. Banks were made in a similar principle. They're the other palaces. You see, if you see a palace on a high street, it's almost certainly a 19th century pub or a 19th century bank. They look fantastic, and they were built entirely to give the middle classes, and only the middle classes, because unlike the pubs, the banks with the middle classes, up until the 1970s, even into the 1980s, working class people in this country did not have bank accounts, and the banks did not want them, did not offer them bank accounts. They had building society accounts, but they didn't have bank accounts. It was entirely to persuade the middle classes that your bank was more financially solid than it probably actually was if they'd looked at the numbers. Instead, they were invited to look at the architecture and the gilding and the marble in the banking hall in order to persuade them to go in there. We live, of course, in a very different world. What's arriving to replace all of this? The answer is, to a large extent, government activity is arriving, and there'll be more of that. So there'll be more retail units taken, as well as the cafés, of course. The planning distinction that made it difficult to turn a shop into a cafe was abolished by Mr. Jenrick, but the line had stopped being held even before then. But it actually was formally abolished by him when he was whatever he was that gave him the power to do it. I can't remember what office that was now, something in MHCLG, when he was a junior minister there. So we do get the cafes, absolutely, but you will see more NHS, more community hubs, and indeed possibly more libraries, because actually, contrary to what, just one thing I disagree with, libraries are not generally a feature of high streets. They tend to be built round the corner or more in the civic compound. But actually, libraries and high streets as part of civic hubs are the sort of thing you're more likely to see. And the other thing you're likely to see is the tax subsidized, if you want to call it that, enterprise, and that is in particular the charity shop. Charity shops, we often look at high streets and say it's full of charity shops. That is a sign of decline. No, it is not in itself a sign of decline. It is a sign of two advantages that charity shops have. They do not have to pay business rates. That makes it costs of occupation are massively cheaper. They're a bit like Amazon, really. And many of their workers work for nothing or little. They're volunteer workers because they're working for a charity. I just make a few points that I would make more clearly if I could read my own writing. The first thing is historically, and it's just worth bearing this in mind if you're talking about Leeds and the remarks that were made earlier. A high street was a high street because it was a main road. It was a human settlement around a main road, and it was the traffic that kept the high street going. In fact, the main purpose of the principal activities on your medieval and 17th and 18th century and 19th and Dickensian high street was the stabling of horses and the accommodation of the people who were being pulled by the carriages, were pulled in the carriages drawn by those horses. That's what high streets did, and the economic activity span off that. Now, we have a better idea Without any proper economic analysis, our notion is that there shouldn't be any vehicles in the high street. Instead, you're going to have some other form of social organization which will draw people to the high street and make them sticky there. But this other form, instead of arising from spontaneous economic activity, has to be devised by planners and by people experts who know what they're doing. So it always works very, very well indeed. But if you talk to people who run businesses in high streets, they want car parking. That's right top of their list. The next thing is the role of government. Am I coming to the end? Am I getting my yellow card? Okay, the role of government always used to be it's a similar point, to take enforcement action on the high street. One of the oldest, if not the oldest, traceable function of local authorities in this country, back to the Middle Ages, was to keep the King's Highway clear. Why? Because every frontager wants to trade rent-free on the highway in front of their shop. Every frontager wants to do it from the Middle Ages to this day, and local authorities are there to stop that happening. And that was really all the local authorities did. Now, of course, that's been taken away, Mr. Generic again, post-COVID. Everyone's encouraged to have tacky marquees out on the street and sort of plastic-covered things where people can sit and have coffee. They make the whole place look absolutely ghastly. But the main point I wanted to make it isn't just that. It's that government now sees itself having a role in curating high streets and managing high streets. And much as Canary Wharf, which is a private space, manages its own private streets, because they're private streets, government wants to manage public streets that you and I pay for, and manage them and curate them. And this will inevitably lead, of course, to the expulsion of people who don't fit into that pattern. This will principally be drinkers and sad and homeless people and things like that. And you'll have more public space management orders and so forth for the purpose of that. So the move from enforcement to curation on the part of government is something worth watching. And now I'm going to draw to a close because Neil has lost interest in what I'm saying and is waving a minor, but as you can see, largely an ineffective red card. Thank you very much.
Thank you. Deborah, you're not going to give me a hard time, are you?
Definitely not going to give me a hard time, but I might be giving everybody a hard time because I'm going to start with a provocation to the audience, which is, when did you last sit at home waiting for a small package to come and say to somebody, I can't go out, I'm waiting for a delivery? Because if you did that, it makes you a high street hypocrite as well, just like me. And one of the dynamics of the society we're living in now is that shift from real places, physical places, to the virtual world we live in. You know, at its very worst, we might say our kids, often our teenage kids, are growing up online. They're not growing up in real places. So when I looked at the idea of, is the high street declining, then part of what I started to think about was the decline in terms of it being a real physical place. That place which in your mind you go, that's where we'll meet. It's obvious. Well, it's less obvious if it's not in people's minds. And the people whose minds it's not in are very often those people who are who really ought to be there, who are perhaps marginalised. And again, talking about kids, but maybe also talking about the elderly and other groups of people who should find that the daily flow of the ebb and flow of their daily lives brings them there, but doesn't. So I'm a designer, and normally if I was to talk to an audience about high streets, I would almost certainly be drawing or showing you images. But I had a conversation yesterday with a young man who interviewed me for his university radio station. And after that, I asked him if he used his, whatever constituted for him, his local high street. And his answer was really interesting. He said he doesn't like browsing in person. He doesn't like fluorescent lights in shops. And he doesn't really like brands either. He feels he's not part of it. And he really dislikes the chit-chat he has to have with people who work in shops and bars and other places like that. He doesn't feel he can do that chit-chat. And but he does go out quite often to the same place in the evening when it's transformed into a place that's right for him and his cohort. So he'll sit with his mates on those tables under the scruffy canopies that look so scruffy by day and are transformed into the place he wants to be in by night. And he will have these lovely conversations, he will feel part of it, and it becomes his place. So what we're talking about is something that's not just shifting in its general, overall importance to us and its necessity to us and our community, but also places that have these daily shifts, weekly shifts, that kind of live a life of their own. And the question about how we design good high streets is, and possibly the reason why many of the reports on this have failed, is because they're just not picking up on all the nuances that they need to and forgetting the granularity of the question, which is as much a societal question as it is a built environment question. Within a built environment, there are lots and lots of ways of looking at places that could be better and trying to work out how to make them better. And they all take money, and they all take funding, and they all take time, and they all take the will of increasingly large groups of people to find a consensus and do them. And nearly all of those things are not easy to come by and often missing and constrained by a planning system that lets shops turn into houses. But one of the things we might need to recognise about how to make high streets and their ilk better for us as a society is to think about all of the things that they could provide for you. And in thinking about this, it's got a few places in mind. Ulverston, where I used to live in the Lake District, which at that time had a sense that you could get anything on Market Street in Ulverston. I could buy a mattress, or I could buy some Cumberland sausage. Or if there was something I couldn't find in a shop, I could ask somebody, and by Market Thursday next week, they'd have it. And so we've lost that sense of it being not just a transactional place, but a place where you curate what you want because you ask for it. There were community notice boards where I could both read the notices other people had put up and feel part of that community, or put my own notice up, again, making things happen there. And some of the things that stop this happening are things like the homogenization of high streets, the way that so many of these places often look the same because the same brands with the same shop fronts, the same window display, and even the same images that you've just seen on your screen or your telly advertising things to you then appear again to give you more of the same. They're bland, they're boring, and we're filtering it out. We're not wanting to go there. So that's sort of stopping anything interesting popping up. The proliferation of empty shop fronts is a problem. But I think it's not just the shop fronts that are a problem. I might come back to that. But I wanted to mention that I don't think it's just a ground floor issue. I really think this is a whole facade issue on the high street. And I'll give you a couple of examples. If a high street's going to be pedestrianised, and there are lots of good reasons in areas for doing that, one of the things that needs to happen is that you're going to need in the summertime shade, in the wintertime shelter, and a great thing to provide that is this nostalgic canopy. The sense that if I started at one end and got off my public transport or parked my car in a 20-minute space for free, I can walk down the high street and I'm covered up under the shade. Or in the summer, it's not going to rain on me. And things that we do to shape it really, really work. On the first floor, one of the great ideas from an old client of mine on Chiswick High Street was that first floor use is fantastic for old people's homes. They sit in the windows, on their balconies, they look at the high street, they provide passive surveillance, they're interested, and they feel that they're part of high street life. This intergenerational issue is really important, but really solvable with some of the things that high streets can provide. And I'll end on the idea that a high street is really a place to be yourself. After you've made all your online purchases, you're not going to sit at home and show off your clothing to yourself in your bedroom. The the Italian idea of passeggiata strikes me as being a lovely way of bringing back the idea that we do want to be seen, we want to be out there. And it might be at midnight when the pub or the club spills out. It might be in the morning. But the sense of parade, not just of a parade of shops, but a parade of people, might bring back some of the life that we need in high streets.
Thank you very much. Can we thank our speakers?